Hey, friends and fellow geekologists. You're getting ready to hear one of the panels we hosted at Theology Beer Camp last October in Missouri. A huge thank you to Trip Fuller and Homebrew Christianity and the Venues Church for hosting us and allowing us to be a part of the Zest. We had so much fun, and it was so meaningful to be at the intersection of philosophy, theology, and pop culture with some amazing experts in those fields of discipline. We do have the dates for Theology Beer Camp 2024. It will be October 17th through 19th in Denver, Colorado. And this year, the title for Beer Camp is going to be The Return of the God Pods. You can follow God Pods 2024 on social media with any updates that they share with us. And tickets are on sale now. And so we hope to see you there in October.
Guys, Christian here. Normally on the show, we attempt to keep things as child-friendly as possible, but every now and then we can hit some harder subject matters or may even have some verbal discourses that may not be suitable for younger or more sensitive ears to hear. In this episode, there may be either a discussion on more mature topics or may have strong language, or perhaps both at once. Your discretion is advised.
All right, y'all. We are going to get started here just because we're we're almost at 3:55 here. But my name is Nick, and I am one of the co-hosts on Systematic Ecology. I did the Tolkien Heads class with Trip for Homebrewed Christianity right before the release of Rings of Power. And then I also write a Substack called Tolkien Pop, which explores the intersection of pop culture and Tolkien in general, because Tolkien touches all things, including Star Wars, which if you were here from before we even were talking about, the trilogy and the ongoing expanse of Star Wars, which is very Tolkien-esque. But our guest today, who's going to be talking with us, is Craig Boyd, who I'm going to let him kind of fill in the details here, but he is a professor at St. Louis University, correct? Craig is awesome. We got to meet through some Tolkien scholarship circles, and Craig got to speak at a online Tolkien conference that me and Trip organized called Interchanging Melodies, which kind of explores religious pluralism and ecumenical approaches to Tolkien. And so Craig is going to talk a bit, and then TJ and I will come back and ask him questions. And of course, you all will be welcome to ask questions and interact with Craig. So Craig, let's give Craig a round of applause for being here, because Craig is very cool. And then Craig will take it from here. So thanks, Craig. Tell us a little about yourself and take it.
Thanks, Nick. My background is actually in medieval philosophy, and I've also done a good deal of work in virtue ethics, and I like to say I'm better at the vices than the virtues, but that's kind of an existential situation for me, okay? So just bear with me there. But I got into reading Tolkien when I was very, very young. I started Lord of the Rings when I was 6, after my brother read to me The Hobbit when I was 5. And I asked him, I said, are there any other books like this? And he said, oh, yes, there are. And so I remember going with my mother to the library, going to the children's section, looking for these books. And of course, they weren't there. And I was very disappointed. But the librarian said, well, hold on, wait a minute. These books are upstairs in the adult section. And I kind of rolled my eyes. I remember that. And we trudged up the steps to the adult section. And sure enough, they were there. So we checked it out, and there weren't as many pictures as I had hoped there would be, because I was 6. It took us 2 years to read through them, and I would ask her often, how do you say this word? And of course, I didn't know that they weren't English words. I didn't know that many of them were made up, and neither did she. So I've had a lifelong love of Tolkien. And so recently, just a couple years ago, at my advanced years, I've started a master's degree in literature, and I'm about 2/3 of the way through. So I want to really understand the literary elements here. So I'm not just simply this person who says, well, I have a PhD in this one area, therefore I can speak authoritatively about everything else. I don't want to be that person. So that's kind of my background there. I'm a professor of philosophy and humanities at St. Louis University, and it's great because they let me write on pretty much whatever I want to write on. So the last few years I've been working on Tolkien, and I do some things in unusual ways. I've got an essay coming out with my daughter on Tolkien and Foucault, titled Foucault's Towers and Tolkien's Panopticon. So for those of you who know Foucault, that's, you might find that entertaining. But just a little bit of preface here. How many of you have read the letters, Tolkien's letters? Okay. In his letter 56 to his son Christopher, he writes about going out with his friend C.S. Lewis. And this is really appropriate for Theology Beer Camp for a reason you will see very quickly. He says, I went out with Lewis this last Tuesday, and he put away 3 pints before lunch. Now, you have to understand that imperial pints are 20% larger than American pints. So by noon, C.S. Lewis had consumed half a gallon of beer. Okay? Now, for me, reading that, being raised pietist, where we knew that alcohol was evil, that was a liberating experience for me. Okay? So that's something I thought was really appropriate for the context here. And then I should preface this also with the joke that many of you know about the priest who visits the family with a young son, and the priest asks the parents, he says, do you read to your son from the good book? And they say, oh, yes, Father, we do, every night. And the priest asks, well, what's his favorite part? And the parents say enthusiastically, the part where the ring is destroyed at Mount Doom. And so with that in mind, I will turn to the good book. Book 6, Chapter 2, page 922. One of my favorite passages, and this is In the Land of Shadow. Far above the Ifil Duath in the west, the night sky was still dim and pale. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor, high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. The conclusion of this, because I'm a lector at a Catholic church, I want to say the word of the Lord. Thank you. But that is just such powerful language. And for me, that captures what I think is really kind of the key, at least from my understanding, of Tolkien's work, and that is this tension, this battle, if you will, or a dialectic between hope and despair. And so if you've read many of the commentaries or the secondary literature, you might read something by Verlyn Flager, who has this book, Splintered Light, and so she really gets into the light and darkness themes. But of course, light and darkness parallel hope and despair. They really do. And I think that is what's going on if you go all the way back to the Silmarillion. You read the history of Middle-earth, you read all of these, you read the entirety of his work, including the nonfiction, which I think is very illuminative in terms of trying to understand his work. So my basic approach here today is trying to see hope and despair as the key to kind of seeing how Tolkien is grappling with these existential questions, okay? Now, that quote is from Sam, and Sam, of course, is, Tolkien says, the chief hero. He's not the only hero, but he's the chief hero, and I love that. But Sam is also humble, and this notion of humility is tied in also with hope, because the person who has hope is also humble in the sense that they know they're going to need help to achieve their task. But of course, this word humility and human and humor all are linguistic cognates, and they all come from this Latin word for earth, humus. And what is Sam's job? And where does a gardener work? He is very close to the earth. He is a very earthy character, if you will, right? And not just in the physical sense, but in the metaphoric sense. He's a very earthy character. Sam has humility, but he also has hope. But there are others who have hope. Gandalf wears the ring Narya, and Narya is the ring that encourages hope, okay? And so you have this element of hope that's going through it, but then you have Aragorn, whose name in Sindarin is Estel, and that name means hope. The word hope is mentioned 187 times just in The Return of the King, okay? So that's just one of, well, actually it's two of the books, because because you are at the geek stage, there are 6 books, not 3. Right? All right. Can I get an amen there? Yeah, thank you. So what does that mean? It means that I think this is very important to Tolkien. So what do we mean by hope? So I want to start with hope, then I want to look at despair, and then I want to return to hope once again. So because I'm a medievalist myself and I write on virtue ethics, I like to go to Thomas Aquinas, and he gives us a definition of hope that is the patient expectation of a difficult but possible future good. Let me repeat that. It is the patient expectation of a difficult but possible future good. Okay? And that is what these characters have. It has to be patient. Okay? You don't get it immediately. It's an expectation because you're waiting for it, and it's difficult. The trip to Mordor is not a walk in the park. Right? It's a difficult good, but it is a good. And because it is a good, there is something about hope that really expresses who we are in this life right now. The philosopher Joseph Pieper, in his book, Faith, Hope, Love, talks about hope in terms of what he calls the status viatoris. Okay, I'm sorry I'm using Latin words here, and I hope you'll be patient with me. But status viatoris, a viator, is a person on a journey. And what are the characters doing most of the time in The Lord of the Rings? They're walking on a journey, right? Yes, there's an unexpected journey, and one does not just walk into Mordor. Okay, right? Now, I'm going to mix in some of the movie and some of the book, of course, here, but bear with me a bit. It's a journey. And so a person on a journey is hoping to get to that destination. And once you get to that destination, once you get there, I'm going to return to this a little bit later, you have joy at the end of the journey. Because joy is being in the presence of the good or in the presence of the beloved. That's why your dog is so excited to see you when you come home. That dog is experiencing joy. It's doggy joy, not human joy, okay? But it's still joy. And so what you have then is this notion that this journey, it finds us in the middle of things. In media res is the Latin term. We are all in the middle of things. Now, some of us might be a little bit closer to the end of the middle. Some of us might be closer to the beginning of the middle of our journeys. But the journey is where we are, and it's contrasted with something called the status comprehensoris. The status comprehensoris, the person who is a comprehensor, is someone who has attained it all, who understands it all, who believes that they know it all, and so there is no movement. So the person who is a viator is on the move. The person who is the comprehensor is static. And this tells us something about two vices that are opposed to hope. One is pride, and they can actually exist at the same time. So the person who is proud assumes that they've already arrived, and so there's no reason to be on the journey. They already know, okay? They know everything. But the other vice that is opposed is despair. So if we return to that definition of hope as the patient expectation of a difficult but possible future good, the person who has despair, and the Latin word here is literally despair, that person is at the point where that good is no longer possible, okay? So the person who is in despair is also stuck. The person who's in despair cannot move, okay? Now, this takes us into kind of managing hope here a little bit, because hope is Aquinas says, it's an emotion, but it's also a virtue. And as a virtue, what we have to understand about hope is that hope is this virtue where we are hoping in the good, and the good helps us because the good is a person. The good is God who helps us hope. in the journey, and we are hoping for God and in God. So there's this permeation of hope in the life of the person who is the viator. Because once you stop, it's because you think you've already arrived or because you think there is no reason to continue on. Okay? If you think about the person who suffers from despair the most in The Lord of the Rings, it's Denethor. What's interesting about the contrast between Denethor and one of the other antagonists, Gollum has hope until the very end, doesn't he? I mean, it's not a virtuous hope, okay? Because he desires something evil, not something that's good, right? But he thinks it's good, but he's still hoping all to that very end, and finally he has it. And got to tell you here, spoiler alert, he dies. Okay, I know that's a shock to you, and I apologize to everyone who's listening. Yes, it's true. But Denethor is really interesting because he has pride, and of course, what facilitates his pride is that he has a palantir. And where does he look at the palantir? Where is he when he does this? He's up in the tower. Are there other people with him helping him understand what's going on with the palantir? No, he's by himself. And if you read Unfinished Tales, you'll see that the palantir was designed to make the knowledge public to everyone, not private. And here's another interesting play on words. This word private that we have comes from this word provatio, which means a lacking. So it was meant to be shared fully, the knowledge of the palantir with other people rather than hidden and, making the rest of the community lack in their knowledge. And so, of course, we have another person who has a palantir who also inhabits a tower by himself, the wicked wizard Saruman. So this is really interesting that because Denethor has this, and he's also kind of infatuated with his own wisdom and his own intelligence and his own knowledge. He trusts in himself, and he trusts that he understands what's going on in the palantir. And of course, he's deceived. And whenever Gandalf tells him something, he objects to it, he calls Gandalf a fool. Very interesting, the use of the term fool, by the way, throughout. Who is called a fool and who is using the term fool? Of course, Gandalf calls Pippin a fool of a took. And he is, but thank goodness Pippin, develops and matures, and so he's no longer a fool by the end. But there's this notion that anyone who does not agree with my assessment is a fool because they're not as smart as I am, because I alone have knowledge of this. And so when he despairs alone. And here's something very important to remember is that when people despair, they despair alone. When they have hope, they hope in a community and with a community. So even Frodo and Sam, just the two of them, they have a community that helps them along, And there's a line where Pippin asks Gandalf, is there any hope? Hope for Frodo? And Gandalf says to him, well, only a fool's hope, or so I've been told. So I find that this whole notion of despair particularly powerful. And one of the things about what Tolkien does in The Children of Húrin and in Unfinished Tales, he uses a technical term. It's called wanhope. And wanhope is an Old English term. And if you know much about Tolkien himself, he worked on the very first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. How many of you were aware of that? And you know what letter he worked on? W, yes. 10 points for Gryffindor. So what you find there is he is editing all of these words on W, and of course he's working with wanhope, wander, all of these things. And so this word wan has the idea of a lacking, an emptiness, if you will. And there's a cognate with the word vanity. So vanity probably should be called wanity in the sense of it is a false or an empty sense of pride in oneself. And so wanhope is one of these words. There's also another word that is used in his edited edition of the medieval text on Creen Wisa, and that's called unhope. But he uses wanhope here, and wanhope is a particular kind of despair. It's a theological definition of despair. and it is the despair that not even the grace of God is powerful enough to save me. And there are some theologians, I'm not a theologian, by the way, I'm a philosopher, so I'm just riffing here, okay? So indulge me. A number of theologians say that one hope is the unforgivable sin. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was 7 years old and I read about the unforgivable sin, I was wondering, have I done that? Have I committed that? If it's unforgivable, then I can't get forgiveness, can I? And so I had lots of angst about that in the rapture. We're not going to go there tonight or this afternoon, okay? But this notion of one hope, you can see it he uses it to describe Denethor. Denethor has one hope. He no longer has hope in the grace of, you might even say, the good. Now, of course, if you're someone who has studied medieval philosophy like I have, well, the good is God. God's a very being, so the good is, and of course in the Lord of the Rings, there isn't a whole lot, explicit, there's not much there in terms of the divine beings, but, looking at the entire corpus, you've got the Silmarillion, and of course, Eru Ilúvatar is the good, right? So what you have then is this notion of a despair that not even the divine can save me. Probably in the English tradition, the best example of this is Dr. Faustus, where he's being encouraged to just throw yourself on the grace of God. He says, I can't, I'm so bad, I can't do that. So this kind of despair is a despair that is done in isolation, and it is a despair that one cannot find one's way out because one is so bad, one is so upset, one is so distraught that there is no glimpse of light anywhere. So there is no hope. So what do we do in the face of despair? In Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, the very end, you probably all know this passage where he's talking about what is the good of fairy stories, and he lists a number of reasons. There's escape, there's reconciliation, there's all these kinds of things. But he introduces this term eucatastrophe, and he defines it as the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, the sudden joyous turn. It is a small, sudden, miraculous grace, or it is a sudden miraculous grace, never to be counted on or to recur. It does not deny the existence of dicatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world and poignant as grief. This is what happens in The Lord of the Rings, where that's, if we return to Sam here as I wind up, Sam's vision of the star. He knows that the darkness is a passing thing. And so if we fast forward to the field of Cormoran, Sam wakes up and he finds it hard to believe, and he says to Gandalf, is everything sad going to come untrue? And what happens is that Gandalf laughs, and he laughs with him, and Sam laughs, and they laugh until they cry. And that, I think, is a joyous, poignant ending to, there are 7 or 8 different endings, but this one, I think, is the most poignant for me. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, for that awesome thing. I'm standing up here with this microphone. I'm going to sit, but I feel like our last interaction with the Star Wars thing was so interactive that I'm going to try to stand up, and if you have a question, I'm going to give you the microphone to kind of talk so we can have that recorded. But Greg, thanks again for that awesome talk. Towards the end, I feel like this happens in Tolkien circles, that you read from The Lord of the Rings and tears come to the eyes, and so I'm about to cry. But with this hope and despair thing, I think a lot of the theme kind of around Theology Beer Camp is this deconstruction. And so you talk about hope and despair, and a lot of people who go through this weird experience of religion, questioning their faith, they end up in this despair and don't know that it's a fleeting thing, right? And then after they get through it, maybe they see the star, right? They see Earendel in the sky, even if they don't know it like Sam does, right? And they feel this hope. So could you, could you translate that to this experience of deconstruction as somebody who's gone through different faith experiences yourself, and maybe talk about just more of like Sam as an inspirational person that we can look up to as a virtuous character as we go through this deconstruction. How can we look to Sam as a sort of saint to kind of help us through this journey?
Thank you for calling Sam a saint. I did a sabbatical a few years ago at the Collegeville Institute at St. John's University. And while I was there, I met a Buddhist monk who was doing Christian icons. And he knew I was working on Tolkien. And so for Christmas, he made me an icon of Sam Gamgee. And it is one of my prized possessions. And I think if you look at what Tolkien is doing, especially if you read the letters, he talks about Sam being this rube who just wants to go off and see the elves, but he really matures as a person, and he becomes this individual on the journey and even after the journey. So when he has the materials that Galadriel gives him from Lothlorien, he doesn't save it for himself, but he gives out to the entire Shire and does this, which is an act of profound grace, if you will. So he really has this journey, and I find that fascinating. So I think in terms of the deconstruction, I think there has to be a recognition that we are all on a journey, and the only way with the journey is with a fellowship. You'll notice that also that there are three characters who have, at least three, you can talk about Aragorn too if you want, but three characters who have difficult encounters with the Palantir. Denethor, who is isolated, Saruman, who's isolated, and Pippin, who is by circumstance simply constrained by the fellowship that he's with because he can't get out of the room. Okay? He simply can't. And so it's not by some virtue of his own. And Tolkien talks about the success of the fellowship. It's not based on Frodo because Frodo is a failure, he says. But it's the success of the fellowship, even though there are individuals who fail. And I think it is more the success of the fellowship and the journey rather than, so there are times in which I will need help from the fellowship, and there are times in which I can help others in the fellowship. And so I think this idea of deconstruction is really kind of, the journey is really kind of a metaphor for that in terms of how we develop as persons. And so for me, I would say that the notion of the good, and I have lots of friends who are atheists and agnostics and various forms of Christian. But what I think is fascinating is that we all have kind of a basic grasp of what the good is. And we know when people are doing bad things, all you have to do is turn on the news and we can agree that all of these things are bad. What are the causes of them? Well, that usually extends beyond most of our capacity, but we can see when innocent, human beings are being brutally murdered. We know that's wrong. There's no question. You don't have to have any specific religious orientation to that or not. And you can see acts of heroism and courage and compassion. You don't have to be a Christian to know that that's true. You don't, because there's some basic notion of the good. And I think much of our lives are just simply an ability or that process of trying to grasp the good and then trying to get our own lives into conformity with that good. And we cannot do it by ourselves. So that's kind of the way I would kind of think about this notion of deconstruction. I'm continually deconstructing and reconstructing, I think, and that's part of the journey, because sometimes you make a wrong turn and you have to correct yourself. Sometimes you have to go back 3 or 4 miles and then take another road, because you're not going to get there just simply by trying to, get yourself out of a canyon that has no exit except the way you came in.
So I feel like Tolkien is one of the, it kind of hurts me to say nerdy things that is, pretty surface level. Like you can get into Tolkien, you can watch the Lord of the Rings movies, and you can still be so far from where the real conversations are happening. But I recently had a friend who grew up in rural South Carolina, was discouraged from reading, and, well, who cares? You can read a book, you know how to tackle, get outside. And I've recently been helping him become more scholarly. And I told him to read Dune first before I introduced him to anything else. Because Dune is hard to read, but much easier to understand, I feel, than Tolkien. And so that's the end goal. I'm going to get him to get super into, Tolkien life and, understand Lord of the Rings. So do you feel like there's a better starting point for those who are like uninitiated? Is, because like everybody's seen Lord of the Rings, but few people have read it and tried to understand it that way.
Well, I think you raised something that's really important there. You have to have a certain patience with reading Lord of the Rings. And maybe it's a patient expectation of a difficult but possible future good.
Especially in book 4.
Yeah. The journey to Mount Doom is just exhausting. It really is. For me anyway. But I think that I would look at some of the other works. I would start. I mean, The Hobbit is, it's a children's book, but it's also it's on at least 2 levels. So there's kind of there's a wink and a nod to the audience, and it moves pretty quickly. It moves a lot more quickly. So I would start with The Hobbit, and then one of my favorites is Leaf by Niggle. And that's how I started getting into publishing on Tolkien's, writing a paper on hope in Leaf by Niggle. So if you want to know more about hope and my views on that, it's trying to, and that's, it's 27 pages long. And Lord of the Rings is a little bit longer. And so there's, of course, hope permeates both of them. And I think that maybe, there are shorter things. I think I also love Farmer Giles of Ham. I think it's hilarious. And there's a dragon, a silly dragon, a really silly dog. There are all of these different things going on. So kind of the shorter ones, and then see that's what I would do personally if I had a friend who was, trying to get, because I think The Hobbit hits people at many different levels. And I just think it's, for me, that's what I would do. But of course, Lewis has his books, but his are a bit too allegorical for me. It's just, I feel at times it's heavy-handed, but my favorite of Lewis's books is The Silver Chair. That for me is really, it moves along pretty well. It's got all of these themes in it. I'm working on a paper right now where I'm trying to think about Puddleglum's argument with the Green Lady and Gandalf's argument with Saruman after the Battle of Helm's Deep. So I'm doing a paper on rhetoric and kind of, you can be suave and smooth, but wicked, and you can be good and just kind of basic. So there's that. So I mean, for me, you might even do something like that. But people, there are, I don't have a hatred for Lewis. I know there are some, Tolkien people who do. I like reading Lewis. I think Lewis is still relevant, but that's my favorite, The Silver Chair. Thinking about that, maybe.
Yeah. So no, I've heard a few people who are like, well, Lewis and Tolkien were friends, so to understand one, you have to know the other.
No, I don't think so at all. And Lewis, Lewis is doing all these allegories, and Tolkien famously says, "Well, I hate allegories," and of course, Tolkien is a bit like a thinker, like Augustine. It depends on which Augustine you're reading and which day of the week you happen to catch him. And that's the way it is, kind of like John Wesley as well. Well, what's he talking about this week? Well, it's that kind of thing. So Tolkien is like that, even though he admits in a moment of weakness that Niggle is an allegory. But there's that sense of what's going on. So.
Thanks, Greg. For those of you who don't know as well, Tolkien, if you're trying to get into Tolkien, Leaf by Niggle is a short story, and Farmer Giles of Ham is also a short story that Tolkien wrote that's outside of the legendarium of the Tolkien Middle-earth universe, okay? And so both of them are kind of, they're fiction, but also you can see some elements of Tolkien's life kind of emerge from these stories. Now, Farmer Giles of Ham, there's lots of debates on whether, or is it Smith of Wootton Major?
Smith of Wootton Major is the one that best encapsulates his views on fairy stories.
Yeah, so Smith of Wootton Major, also a short story that Tolkien wrote, worth reading, very good outside of the Middle-earth universe, that sort of thing. So,
and if you'll let me interrupt you there,
yes, please.
His mature view on elves is in Smith of Wootton Major, so that's, if you will. So he starts out very early. using elves as kind of, they're like goblin feet is one of his first poems. And so the elves develop over time. There's kind of an evolution of the elves across the various works. So sorry to interrupt.
No, that's great. We talked about on the Star Wars session that we talked about the Force and Star Wars as kind of like this tension between fear and love, and how love is kind of like this true embodiment of the Force, and how when people actually embody the Force rightly or virtuously, that it's because they are doing something with the aim of ensuring that people that they love experience the good. Okay, Obi-Wan with Luke and Leia, etc. Right? And so you talked about the fellowship and going through deconstruction and not doing things that are good unless it's with the fellowship. And so many of us do things that are alone. And even in Star Wars, right, later on, Ben Kenobi is very much alone, right? But he's still doing these things. So in these moments where we feel very much alone, and maybe even someone like Frodo who feels very much alone, right? Bilbo early on and later. Maybe Aragorn as he's trying to find Gollum. And, all these characters that experience this isolation based on Lord of the Rings, but, I'm kind of using Star Wars as this launching point. Reading Tolkien, like as we experience this desert moment of faith, maybe do you have any advice as far as like whether it's here or somewhere else in your own faith tradition, how can we pursue fellowship even if it doesn't mean I've re-experienced Jesus Christ or something like that, a revival? How can we pursue fellowship to find some sort of grounding with some sort of hope?
That's a great question. And I think after, I don't know if it's correct to call this a post-pandemic world that we live in. I don't. I'm not certain how to use those terms. But over the pandemic, the community that I had at Collegeville included some great people, and we would Zoom once a month. We had a Zoom meeting last week, but it's Zoom cocktail hour. What we do, and we participate as much as we can in one another's lives. I had 3 friends from high school who we were all kind of thinking the same thing, and we just started sending group messages to one another, just trying to be a source of encouragement to one another. So I think community, you need to get it however you can. I mean, I don't quote John Lennon a whole lot, but whatever gets you through the night, there's that sense of, what can you get in terms of a community? And I think there's no real substitute for face-to-face, person-to-person, because biologically something happens to us. I mean, my heart, my brain is experiencing right now the electric impulse of your heart beating right now. Yeah. So because you're that, so there's something going on. And that's why you have that limbic connection to your dog. Okay. Because, and since the pandemic, my dog is with me 24/7, basically. And so she's probably freaking out this weekend, so but there's this kind of connection that we have to other, we're animals, and not in a bad sense. That's who we are. And that's an important thing. So we have to have some kind of connection. But I would say also, if you think about, so I had a friend text me this week asking about, she had a really rough week. Do I have any suggestions? And just was really down. I said, go read Leaf by Niggle. And she did. This is kind of my standard response. And I've never had someone respond to me by saying, that was worthless. No, they respond by saying, that was really a source of encouragement to me. So there are, like you said, there are many places where you can end up crying, when Thorin dies, first time I read it to my daughter, she said, I didn't know Thorin was going to die. And, so we cried together,
Right.
End of Leaf by Niggle, Niggle's not this important person, and that's okay, but he doesn't end up alone. And so I think there's also kind of this notion, even, the biblical text in Hebrews, you're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And so can you think about those people? So I had one of my mentors passed away a couple years ago. And he said, when I think about my parents, and they've both been deceased for many years, he said, I have no doubt that my mother is interceding on my behalf in front of the throne of Christ, saying, Jesus, help little Frankie. Frank was his name. And I just thought about that. And I just thought about that there is a sense of love, and love is a form of affirmation is a form of love. And if you've ever been affirmed in your life in anything, that is something that you should be able to absorb into your soul in such a way that it gives you encouragement and it gives you hope. And to me, that's how I try to think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Kind of speechless from that response. And of course, if anybody has any comments or questions, feel free to raise your hand or interject. I see pointing Ryan. Go ahead.
Speak.
So Ryan Doe's everybody.
Weirdly, my shit, I'm gonna cry. So
I have this effect on people.
Yeah, no,
usually because it's bad.
Yeah, no, I almost cried when I saw him.
So when you said example of despair is Denethor, my favorite character is Faramir. And when you said shit, when you said Denethor's despair is experienced in isolation, my first question was, but Denethor's despair immediately affects Faramir's hope. And because you're going back and forth between, the hope and the despair and hope and despair. And I think of, and maybe it's because David Wenham performs this so beautifully, but when he says, of course, it is now that you had wished that our places had been reversed. For a son to say that to a father.
Yeah. Yes.
And then for Denethor to just say, yes, I do wish that. And of course I'm quoting from the movies and I'm probably getting some of this wrong and whatever, but like from the movie when he says like, if I return, think better of me. And he says it will be determined on the manner of your return. And I'm like, you fucking asshole. But then, and that scene, it's both my favorite scene in the whole movie, and it tears me apart every time. And like, I have a great relationship with my dad. I don't have this, but I'm feeling on behalf of Faramir as a son, and someone who wants nothing better than to serve his people.
Right.
And then when he's marching towards the gates and people are throwing the flowers down, and I'm just like, that scene, it makes me into a wreck. Yeah. But then Gandalf yells out, your father loves you. Yeah. And at that moment, if I was Faramir, I'm like, the fuck he does, look where I'm going.
Right.
And then he says he will remember it before the end. It tears me apart every time. And then of course, Billy Boyd sings the beautiful song and I'm just like, thanks, Peter. Now I'm completely sobbing.
Yeah.
So all that coming back to the fact that Denethor's individual despair has this disastrous implication for a city's hope. Mm-hmm. Not just a city's hope, a people's hope, a person's hope, his own son's hope is affected by this man's private despair. And I don't really know, sorry, Craig, I don't really know what I want you to do with that. It's the example of it that I see most evident because it's the scene and the character that I love the most.
Sorry, just stuff you mentioned. When I first read The Lord of the Rings and watched the movie, I had this visceral reaction to Denethor. I can't stand him for what he does to Faramir. Yeah. Like I can't. And during the pandemic, and I might cry too, but I've lost 4 people. My parents 43 hours apart because of COVID. Another friend committed suicide, and another friend did MAID. So that's my last 3 years. The friend that committed suicide, we were friends 55 years. And she came from a wealthier family, and I don't know what happened. I think she got the COVID really ruined her financially and personally. And the last time, I had no idea. The last time I talked to her, though, she started speaking this nonsense, this, help me, people, that this information. What do you talk about? That kind of crazy nonsense. And something that you said about Denethor alone in his tower with the Palantir, I'm thinking, that's disinformation. That just, the light bulb just went on.
Yeah.
And that ruined my friend.
Yeah.
She did not speak like that before. I'm Canadian, but we have our own Trump in Ontario. But we would talk about Trump, we'd talk about Doug Ford, and we talked about compassion for the poor, and they're doing these awful things in Ontario, ruining the protected green belt to build McMansions, that sort of thing. But the last time I talked to her, she was speaking nonsense, and I didn't pick up on it. And then less than a month later, she was dead. And I'm like, this is, sorry to bring a downer on this, but it's kind of like, I think maybe Tolkien saw something with that Palantir.
Yeah. So
Isolation.
I think, first of all, I'm so sorry for your losses, your multiple losses. I'm deeply, deeply sorry. I think that's, yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah. And I do think that this idea of that notion of isolation, and I would make an important distinction between despair as a vice and depression as a mental illness. So I think sometimes, and I had a recent workshop at work. How do you identify students who are suffering with depression? And so I asked the presenter, I said, well, how do you make the distinction between something that is choice and something that's beyond your choice? Because for despair is the choice to go to the tower by yourself and to exclude others. Depression is something that is really beyond your control in terms of your mental health, in terms of these other kinds of things. And I think, at some point they may overlap like a Venn diagram, but I do think that we can make distinctions. And the thing about, that Saruman is a better example here. In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien writes that the Astari, the wizards, were all meant to go out among the people and to be constantly on the move, on the journey. Okay. And what does Saruman do? He sets up camp in a tower by himself and refuses to be about other people. And so this, in the end, he isolates himself. He sees others not as persons, but as objects to be manipulated. Gandalf sees others as persons to be cared for and to be with them. And you cannot be above them and look down on them and still be with them and participate in their lives. And so the difference is that there is a kind of metaphysical and moral participation in the lives of one another. And you cannot force someone to participate in your life, but you can constantly invite people. What does Gandalf do with Bilbo? He invites him on a journey into a community, and I think that is critical. So back to the question about what do you do with Denethor? I think Denethor, there's this isolation that's a choice. It's not I don't think he has a mental illness. I think this is a choice that he chooses to love Boromir better than Faramir. He chooses to do these things. And that is a certain kind of toxicity in his own life, but it's a toxicity in the life of the community because the entire community suffers. And you think about Boromir on the journey, he's isolated until his point of redemption. There's this kind of isolation that you see, and that's toxic to the fellowship, obviously, and it's toxic to him. So I don't know if that takes us anywhere, but
right. No, I feel like depression feeds despair so well that it's really hard to be on top of that unless you're actively reaching out and speaking to the people who love you, and that's not something that comes naturally to us because we're not, isolationist creatures. We are social. We're supposed to be, surrounded by our fellow people. And, the pandemic, kind of made that impossible. And so for people who weren't able to, ensure that they were surrounded by those that loved them, it was really, really difficult. And that's just something that we can't do anything about sometimes. And it's, something you solve by checking in on, just checking on literally everyone and it's just not easy. It's not feasible even. And that's something we have to deal with that, sometimes there's nothing we can do and just hope and pray that they can work that out. And
So I appreciate the attention to isolation and community in talking about hope. But how broad must this difficult but possible future good be for hope to be virtuous? So I'm thinking about the elves fading into the west.
Mhm.
Are they virtuously hoping for Frodo to succeed? Or are they resigned to fade regardless of the outcome of the journey? Like, are the elves actually fading as a virtuous thing for the rest of Middle-earth? Or are they being the kind of jackasses that they seem to be in Rings of Power?
Both.
I think this is a kind of the natural evolution or the doom in the sense of Tolkien uses the term doom. It's your fate. It's not so much fate, but it's what happens to you. And so this is simply the natural evolution, I think. And so when Galadriel says we're fighting the long defeat, that's, it's a defeat in the sense that the elves cannot win this. Okay. So it has to be taken on by someone else. But in terms of the notion of hope as a virtue, I didn't talk about this in my presentation, but oftentimes this notion of hope as an emotion, which is something that we have, so if I came here hoping for beer, I really did. And if there wasn't any beer, that was an emotion. It's a desire from my appetitive. Yeah, thank you. So that's an appetitive thing. And my dog has that. My dog has hope. So when I, put the kibble in the bowl, she can hear it from any place in the house, and within 3 seconds, she's there because she has hope. Now, it's not so much a difficult good, but it's something that we all have. But the thing about hope being a virtue, and it's a theological virtue for God, for communion with God and with one another, for that to be virtuous, it has to be something for the good itself and for those goods themselves that transcend the merely physical. Because if you don't have that, then you're just, Mill says it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And if the pig or the fool's any different, it's because they only know their side of the story. And so that point of what Mill is trying to make is that, there are some goods that transcend the merely physical. And so I think, do the elves, are they virtuous? Well, I mean, some of the elves are the worst in the history of Middle-earth when you have the kinslaying. And so to suggest that the orcs are the worst, no, actually, it's probably those elves and the Nazgul. Those are probably two, for me, those are the worst characters. But, I think that do the elves have hope? Well, they have hope getting to the other side of the sea and they'll be fine once they get there, okay? And everybody's cool, all right? But that's part of Tolkien. He's really seeing this as this is our world. It's a fictional version of our world, but they had to leave, and that's why we don't see so many elves these days. I mean, that's one of the things he gets into,
So I just have a couple comments on things you said, and then I do have like a personal comment. So you were talking about the juxtaposition of Gandalf and Saruman and how he isolates himself, Saruman does, and Gandalf is in and with the people. And I just think, I don't know what language you use because I'm forgot already, but it made me think of just Jesus, how he's supposed to be God with us. So it's kind of, I know it's known that there's multiple messianic figures in Lord of the Rings, but it just made me think that also that Gandalf is the redeemed version of Saruman, that he's what Saruman should have been and couldn't be. And so that I just was really kind of a cool connection in my brain. My other comment before the actual thing I wanted to say was, you mentioned Boromir, and we've been talking about Denethor and Faramir, but you just made a quick comment that he redeemed himself at the very end. And one of my frustrations, because I was a movie fan first, and then read the books, and that's why I said book 4 sucks. It drives me nuts. It's crazy. I about quit the series. But one of my biggest critiques outside of book 4 was Boromir's redemption and the lines he says in the movie he does not say in the books.
Right.
And that is one of the best character moments, him relinquishing his pride to Aragorn and saying, I would have followed you. And so I don't know why I'm going to cry,
Right.
but that's such a huge moment for me. And up until that point, like, I'm like, dude, you're a jerk. I don't like you. The pride, I think it's pride, but also the despair that Denethor feels has leached into Boromir, and he feels so pressured to perform for his father, and that's what drives him to the ring. But his redemption arc, I just don't feel like is as powerful in the books.
I just want to real quick. This is the second time today Kim has proven that she should be on stage instead of in the stands with a impromptu microphone. So
thanks,
thank you
TJ,
for
I
that.
appreciate that. I just wanted to comment on it that I think it was a missed opportunity, though. That's what I'm saying.
Lord of the Rings probably has what I would call the most accurate, best movie adaptations, and even still, it's unfortunate that James Cameron's amazing, but the world that he has given life to on film is the Peter Jackson. Sorry, what did I say? Yeah, I've been thinking about Avatar and the Titanic a lot lately. Yeah. Peter Jackson is because like the Titan, and I love submarines, and he Challenger Deep, and it's just unfortunate that the world he chose to bring to life is quite possibly the most studied, intricate, well-crafted world that could have possibly been brought to a screen.
So I just have one last comment, and then I'll hand the mic back, I promise. So I've told Nick this when we were talking about my qualms about Lord of the Rings, the novels, that I about quit after reading book 4, but then by the time we get to the Houses of Healing in Return of the King, that it was like all of that crap that I had to read was worth it for just that chapter alone. I'm a very avid reader, and that is my favorite chapter in all of literature. It was, anyway, very beautiful. But what I wanted to say specifically pertaining to deconstruction is that when I read that chapter, it was last November, I want to say, I was in the midst of, like Ryan described it, as a hurricane of deconstruction, and you don't know where you're going to land, and you feel literally like everything's been ripped out from underneath you. Your life is a mess. The pieces are everywhere. And at that time, having been then an ex-pastor's wife, I'm thinking, do I even believe in Jesus anymore? And I read that chapter, and I know it's a fictional story, and Aragorn's not a real person, and he's not Jesus. But reading about Aragorn and how he heals in that chapter, it's going to make me cry, but it's like this very beautiful picture of what Jesus is like and how Jesus comes into maybe those dark spaces in our lives and is, if I still believe that, able to heal those dark spaces. So I just wanted to say that if not for Tolkien and that chapter, I think my faith journey maybe would have ended a lot sooner instead of me still being on it.
That's great. I was just looking at that chapter myself, and he names himself, and one of the names is Invinyatar, which means healer. And I find that particularly, but it's interesting that he is among the people, and you can't heal people from a tower. Mm-hmm. You have to be participating with them. Right. So thank you for those observations and those comments. And I agree with you about it's much more powerful in the movie. Boromir just makes a confession and then he's gone.
Right.
But I think the thing about Boromir I think that's fascinating is that he truly does desire the good, but you cannot desire the good by any means possible. And that's why Gandalf and Galadriel and Faramir are all aware that the good can only be achieved in good ways, not by coercion and manipulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you have to unclench your fists.
I would just like to comment, this discussion has brought something to the fore that I've been thinking about it, but not in specific terms, how appropriate the entire arc of the Lord of the Rings is in relation or in as a metaphor for the time that we as a nation are going through. We have the ring, which tempts people to believe that by using the power of the ring, they can achieve great good. Boromir is the perfect example of that. We have dark forces that have been conspiring for ages, and they are beginning to arise and to actually appear, and there have been signs and wonders and signs and portents of danger that has not yet arrived, but that will soon be with us. And there are groups working under the earth, as it were, to achieve ominous ends, and they are beginning to surface. They are unashamed, unafraid of being shown for what they are, and brazenly and cravenly pursuing their goals in broad daylight. And there are people who are beginning to realize just how dire the situation is and are questing for a way to fight the darkness. And a lot of people don't have hope or are losing hope because of the seeming invincibility of the forces that have been achieving their ends again and again and again. And just how, at least for me, how resonant it is with the dark times that we live in. And I think of Gandalf talking to Frodo that we don't always have control of the times we live in, and the best we can do is to try to do our best.
Mm-hmm.
And I've butchered the quote, but I think you all know the part of the movie where he says that. Anyway, I just want to thank you for this discussion because it crystallized some thoughts that I've been having on and off for the last few weeks and months.
Thank you. I think that, that also raises that. I go back to, I don't think the movie does a fair job with Denethor. I think it makes him more evil than he truly is, because he does want the good of his people, but then the good of his people he sees as impossible, and it's a dark time for him, and so he just throws in the towel. So he's a very different character, and Tolkien draws attention to this, that he's very different from Saruman. Saruman wants power for power's sake, to control and dominion. And if you read the letters, he's got this, Tolkien hates Churchill, by the way. He despises him.
Yeah.
It's fascinating because he says anyone who desires power is not to be trusted. Not one man in a million, he says, is worthy of that. And then he quotes this medieval passage, nolo episcopari is as good a reason for being a bishop. And nolo episcopari means I do not wish to be the bishop. So that's how only someone who's humble. And this is why Gandalf is so much like a bishop, in the sense that he does not want power. And so Pippin asks him, after so he has this encounter with Saruman, what are you going to do to him? Gandalf says, do? Well, nothing. Because he doesn't see power as something to abuse people. And we have so many people, I think, who may want power for themselves in our current situation. But we also have people who desire power to make things right. But what happens when you desire that power to make things right? You end up being a Denethor or a Boromir, is what Tolkien's take on it is.
Yeah, I think a reluctant leader is probably a good leader, or perhaps even a great leader. Yeah.
Aragorn, Truman.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. I'm a big punk rock guy, so like people in the crowd participating and like on stage is very much my thing. So I've got someone in the back here.
We're gonna start listening to Skindred here in a minute for those ska metal fans out there.
So I'm probably speaking as one of the less well-versed people in Tolkien in the room, but kind of bouncing off of / expanding on the last couple of people who've talked. One of the main things that I've noticed, in the series, and that I've heard over and over and over again here at Beer Camp, is that while there is war and violence and all that crap out in the world, it is not what's going to save us. Like, you've got the hands of a king being the hands of a healer, and you've got the two least warrior-y characters in the entire series going and taking the ring to Mordor and actually saving the place. And it's I think part of why it has continued to be a series that so many people get into and love and find encouraging. And it tapped into a lot of the same themes here, that sometimes it can't always be peaceful. But while there's war in the series, war and violence and going and killing your enemies isn't what saves things. It's not the point. And if you focus solely on that, that's not going to be anything to be glorified. It's going to run people into the ground. That you need your network and you need hope in something other than the sword.
Right.
That reminds me of a line from Henry Nouwen. It's easier to control people than it is to love them.
Yeah.
And that's from his leadership lessons of Jesus, I think. But that really speaks to me. And that's kind of where I see Tolkien and Nouwen kind of as spiritual siblings, in the sense of that it's not by coercion, it's not by manipulation, because once the coercion is gone, once the manipulation is recognized, it is self-defeating.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of along the lines of Amanda's deal, like the whole
Little musical chairs. Yeah, we got a line now.
The whole thing, even like yes, in the books there is like war and violence and all that crap, but even in the midst of all that, there still is beauty. Like even right after they're leaving the mines, right after Gandalf died, Frodo is still going down to see this beautiful mirror lake reflecting the mountains, and no matter where you are, even if there's all kinds of crap, there's going to be something good in there somewhere, no matter how small, even if it's just a pretty reflection or a nice sunset or the one star that you could see. Shoot, even starless nights can be pretty. That's in their own dark way.
Yeah, and I feel like
that's
what?
That's something I find particularly interesting. I'm doing a word study right now on Tolkien's use of the word glimpse. And it's just a glimpse. And he even uses that word glimpse on fairy stories. But he says it's just a glimpse. And so one of the more famous passages is from the Journey to the Crossroads, where they see the head of the king, and it's covered in flowers, and they get a glimpse of it. And so this is really, I think, an important term, and it's used at key places throughout. And you're exactly right. I think that's great. That's a great observation that you've made. That even in the darkest of times, and Sam gets that glimpse of the beauty of the star, and so I think that's really important. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what that is Tolkien being directly informed by the war. That the beauty you can find in the darkest places in each other. You get to see man does care about fellow man, even if it is separated by, a mile of trenches.
So I wanted to shift a little bit from what the gentleman was talking about to juxtapose Denethor to Theoden. Who isn't really despairing, but is under an enchantment, but has lost his ability to journey. Nonetheless, he's stuck. Yeah.
I would say, first of all, yes, there are all of these parallels or these duels. There's Denethor and there's Theoden. There's Boromir and Faramir. There's, and you can do this with so many, Frodo and Gollum. Gollum is the shadow side of Frodo. This is what happens to you when you go bad. All of these, and it's throughout. And that's kind of how I'm structuring my next book on Tolkien, is kind of working with those kinds of things in terms of the virtues and vices. I would push back a little bit. It's not so much, at least in the book, he is less under magic power than he is under deception and the rhetoric and unreasonable influence of Grima Wormtongue. But when you contrast those two, it's really interesting because Theoden has kind of been king in absentia. and Denethor is very involved with his kingdom. He's very involved, but I think there is, of course, they both take on a hobbit as a squire, that kind of, so there's this, all of these, parallels there. But Denethor, I think, is kind of the redeemed version of Denethor, who even has hope. But there's this kind of hope, the charge is ride to ruin. It's what Tolkien calls the northern virtue of heroism. We're all gonna die, but let's go out in a blaze of glory, kind of thing. That's that. Because you read all of those Nordic myths, and it's like, yeah, everybody dies a horrible death, and but it's interesting though, isn't it? It's interesting. So it's, So yeah, you have to Valhalla. So
only
yeah,
if
you
there's
got that.
Valkyrie close.
Right. It's required of me.
Right.
It truly is required of me, and that's one of the interesting things when Gandalf says to Denethor, "The power to take your own life is not granted to you, steward." It's not. And then he used the one, do not die like the pagan. That's another one of those religious terms he very rarely uses, like wanhope, pagan and wanhope, So every time I see those, but you're right. He does it because it's the right thing to do, not because we might not win, but there's a good and we have to try to see if it's possible, and it's going to be difficult. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you got, yeah. Denethor is deceived by the corsairs of Umbar by Sauron, and he thinks that the corsairs of Umbar are actually, the enemy, but it's really Aragorn. Right. Yeah, and you can't see who apparently we are to assume that you cannot see who's occupying those ships.
Right.
Yes. It's,
yeah. Amen.
Yeah.
The line in the book is, even if I saw that thing in the road, I would not pick it up.
Right.
That's because that totally undermines his character.
Mm-hmm.
So my view is that Peter Jackson gets evil in terms of portraying it a lot better than he gets good, because Aragorn also doesn't have the kind of self-doubt that he has in the book. He's humble in the book, but he's not. It's not like he's going through an existential crisis. He knows who he is, and there's an integrity to the character in the book that Peter Jackson does not grasp.
Right.
So, yeah.
With him on the journey.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I argue with my kids
say?
every year we watch it, and I'll say, that didn't happen.
Right.
And that didn't happen. And then there's this, Dad, just shut up. It's what I get. So it's like.
So what does that say
great.
about Peter Jackson? Is Peter Jackson evil? Is that...
He's chaotic neutral.
Yeah. I'm going. Hold on.
Maybe lawful evil.
We're late, and I'm going to end it here. But you can come talk to us at the end and talk and nerd out with Craig, TJ, and me, and other Tolkien nerds here. This has been great. I think before I want to end with a reading of Tolkien, because I think this is something good. But we recognize in our own faith journey, right, whether we are, that something's wrong. Right, we have this disjointing that something's wrong, and we want to respond to that. Right, we've talked about the mechanisms, right, of evil, right, these things that have happened, and what that response looks like every time we kind of are trying to figure that out. And I go back to the words of Gandalf because he brings wisdom. But I'm going to read this one part that he says in the last debate, the Return of the King, when they're trying to figure out what to do after they've won Minas Tirith, right? And they're trying to figure out what to do next. And he says, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule." So, no matter what, we may not have the right answers, but we've got a fellowship, and we know that it's a good thing to fight, and it's a good thing to read Lord of the Rings and hang out with each other. So anyway, give a round of applause for Craig and everybody here. It's very exciting. Come hang out with us afterwards. Yeah.